Hi, AP Psychology students, and welcome to our first lesson on memory. So, the topic we're going to be discussing, memory, is one small topic inside a larger unit of cognition. There's lots of other topics in cognition that we're going to come back to throughout the semester, but I like to start with memory because there are so many things that you can apply to your life from the memory unit right away to improve your life and to improve yourself as a student. So, let's go ahead and get started. Today, we're going to go over some of the basics of memory and we're going to focus on these essential questions. So, what is memory? How does it work? And what models have psychologists developed to help us understand? So, what is memory? Memory is defined as the persistence of learning over time, right? So, this could be a few seconds, it could be a few minutes, it could be hours, days, weeks, years, right? But it has to be over time. What you often think of as learning, psychology classifies as memory. So, how do psychologists know if your learning persisted? Like, how do they know if it's there? Well, there's three ways basically they can tell if the memory persisted. One, you can recall it. So you can retrieve the information you learned, kind of like an essay test. So you just pull it out of your mind and write down as much as you can remember. There's recognizing it. So you can take a multiple choice test or have to pick something out of a lineup. And that is an example of how you have learned it and then you recognize the correct right answer. Or we also know that learning or memory happened if when you try to relearn something, you learn it more quickly the second time. So for example, I took Spanish in high school. I didn't take Spanish in college or after college. But now when I sit down to work on my Spanish, I pick up things much more quickly than if I was having to relearn it or having to learn it the first time, right? So those three things tell psychologists that learning and memory were persistent at some point in time. All right, so specifically, how does your memory work? So human memory has lots of faults, and we'll talk about those in future videos, but it is incredible what it can do, right? Human memory is good at information where you're focused, right? You have to pay attention, zone in. Information we like or we're interested in, information that's emotional, information that matches our previous experience, right? We talked about this already with always trying to form those connections to yourself. And it's good at information we rehearse. Repetition, 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 right? So the first kind of model that psychologists came up with to explain memory is called the information processing model. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, this model is not perfect. And as you will see as we study psychology, most topics or a lot of different concepts have models that psychologists have developed. Sometimes multiple models explain the same thing, but they look at different parts of it. They look at the ins and the outs of it. Sometimes people look at it from different angles, or sometimes when new information comes up, they change the model. So this model, the information processing model, while not perfect, explains a lot about memory. The idea with information processing model is that there are three processes that make our memory function, right? So encoding is the process of getting information into the brain. Storage, keeping it there. Retrieval, getting it out, right? And these processes, they literally sound just like the words do in your everyday life, right? But they apply in this case to memory. So we have this idea you have to pay attention and then it gets encoded, it gets stored, and then it gets retrieved, right? So those are the three processes that your memory uses. Now, this model also says that your memory has three parts, right? So three processes and three parts. So processes are things that you do and parts are kind of conceptually where the memories go in your brain. So you have your sensory memory, which is your memory that's controlled by your senses. See, touch, taste, smell, exactly your five senses that you've come to know. It's very immediate. It's coming in all the time. It's brief. It's quick, right? And it just holds on to it and then passes it along. It passes it along to what we call the short-term memory. And your short-term memory can only hold on to things for just a little bit of time. And if it pays attention and holds on to it, it then hopefully sends it to long-term memory, which should be relatively permanent and limitless. Now, that doesn't mean you can always get at everything. There are definitely errors and issues that come up. But the idea is that long-term memory is where memories can be stored for the long term. Right? So you see how the one moves to the other, moves to the next, right? And then you see in long-term memory how you have here, right? Where short-term memory sends it into long-term, but then long-term, when it's retrieved, sends it back into short-term, where you then use it in your everyday life. So this model that you have in front of you is a combination of the parts and the processes. So you see we have that sensory memory, the short-term memory, and the long-term memory. And then you can see the processes are kind of listed in between. So there's something in your environment, you hear something, your ears pick it up, right? And if you pay attention to what you're hearing, it goes into short-term memory. And then if you don't encode it, right, and really pay attention, it's not stored in long-term memory. And if it's not stored, then you cannot retrieve it, right? So encoding, storage, retrieval work with sensory short-term and long-term memory. However, like I said, sometimes as we get more information, as our ability to do scientific work grows and knowledge grows, we have to change our models. And so there is a newer model that focuses on not kind of overhauling the old model, but just changing one major part, which is short-term memory. So this model is called the working memory model. And this is the idea that we have, instead of it being short-term memory, it's labeled as working memory. This is because we wanted to give you the idea that it's more active, that it's not just a place where memory is stored, but it's a place where memories are coming in from the outside and then also being pulled from the inside, and your brain is actively working on both of them. Kind of like if you had like a little internal scratch pad in your head to kind of work out problems as they were coming at you, right? Your working memory is that scratch pad. So it's processing sensory information and pulling things from long term and then dealing with it right in front of you, right? So for example, if my teacher asks me a question, I have to hear the question, I have to know what they're saying, I have to interpret what the words mean, I have to think about what I know, and then I have to pull the information from long term, and then I have to say it again, and that requires my working memory. This is a little visual of what the working memory is and how all of it feeds into long-term memory. I'm going to explain a little bit more about these parts in the next slide. So working memory has some specific parts that we believe like help it manage all the different tasks that it has to do to make you kind of function on a daily basis. So the three parts that we're going to focus on in AP Psych are the central executive. This is like the boss, right? They coordinate the information, they say what to pay attention to, they set the focus, they ignore things, they bring out other things. It's the one that's controlling the show. Then you have the phonological loop. And this is the part that holds on to auditory information. Auditory information can be things you hear, speaking, it can be reading. It can also be an inner ear, like reading to yourself or thinking to yourself, right? And it can be anything that has to do with language. Then we have, so for example, like remembering your friend's Venmo name or their TikTok account because they tell it to you, remembering what the letters look like, remembering how to say it. Those are all in the phonological loop. Then we have another part, which is the visuospatial sketchpad. And this is the part of your working memory that holds on to visual information, where things are located, what they look like, how they're like kind of manipulated in space. And the central executive can turn on one, can ignore other, can use both, can kind of manipulate what's happening. So we're going to do some examples of this in class so you can kind of see how these work together and kind of conflict sometimes depending on what task you're doing. An example of the visuospatial sketchpad is like remembering where you parked your car. So being able to pull that from your memory and think about it while you're trying to talk to your friend as you walk to your car, right? That would be an example of the phonological loop activating with the visuospatial sketchpad. So if you take a look, this was the original information processing. And then we kind of just put this working memory model over the top of short-term memory. So a lot of the other things have not changed. It's just our understanding of short-term memory as more nuanced and more complicated, and that it is currently always working to help you function in your daily life. That's all for now, AP Psychos. And remember, psychology is flippin' awesome.